10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Freethought in Florida. Freethought in Florida is a production of the Atheist community of Polk County. I'm Sarah Ray. I'm your host. Before we get started, I do want to thank our patrons over at patreon.com/polkatheists. And welcome to our newest patron, Virgil's Cardboard Box. That's an inside joke that if you've been following along our events of the last few months, you'll get that joke. Patreon is another great way to support the atheist community of Polk County and the ongoing production of the show. And we know that times are tough for everybody right now in COVID land. So if you're not able to support us financially, completely understand. Please give us a like, subscribe, share the episodes out to folks that you think would appreciate them. Now, today, I am joined by author and journalist Katherine Stewart. Now, you may have read some of her work in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Religion Dispatches. She's published all over the place. She writes about politics, policy, religion, and education. Her 2012 book, The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children, shined a hot white light on these efforts to invade public schools to convert and proselytize children. And now she's joining us with another timely warning and wake-up call with the power worshippers inside the dangerous rise of religious nationalism. So let's bring Katherine on now. Welcome to the show, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
I sure do appreciate it. I'm glad we were able to put this together so quickly, sort of at the last minute. So the conversation is very timely, of course, and so I appreciate that. Before we get too far down the rabbit hole, I do want to mention that a brief disclaimer, which gives us a fair jumping off point. The atheist community of Polk County, as a 501c3 nonprofit, we do not make endorsements of candidates or parties, but the conversation today is going to be critical of political figures and parties, including some active candidates, on various issues. So remember, the opinions expressed on the show today, as always, are those of the host and guests, and not necessarily representative of the atheist community of Polk County. So that tees us up for a conversation about the Johnson Amendment. But before we go down that road, let's just sort of set the table and get some terms defined so that we're clear what we're talking about. Who are the power worshippers? What is religious nationalism? Set the table for us.
Sure. Christian nationalism is basically the idea that America was founded as an explicitly Christian nation and that our laws should be based on the Bible. And there's this idea that we've moved away from this conception of America, and somehow we have to get back to that. So it's a political ideology that is deeply anti-democratic because, again, it says the foundation of the U.S. is in a particular religion, and it insists that that's what makes us great and distinctive rather than our democratic system of governance or the fact that we live in a democratic republic or our Constitution or a long, if imperfect, history of assimilating very diverse people in a pluralist society. Christian nationalism is also a device for mobilizing and often manipulating a large subsection of the public and for persuading them to vote for the hyper-conservative political candidates that the movement favors. I want to say a couple things about what Christian nationalism is not. It is not a religion. It exploits religion for political purposes. Many people call the movement of white evangelicalism. It is the movement, let's be clear, includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals too, both white and evangelicals of color. And it also includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion, including some hyper-conservative Catholics, subsection of the Pentecostal and charismatic movement. And it even derives some support from people who do not identify as Christian at all. And the thing that's really at issue and at stake in the rise of religious nationalism is not whether we're going to sort of blur the line between church and state or offend the feelings of an outgroup. What's really at stake is the fundamental way that our political system is organized. It's really about whether we're going to continue as a constitutional representative democracy in a pluralist society united by the idea of a democratic republic or not.
And it sure feels like we're sliding away from that.
It does. I mean, I think it's also really helpful when you're trying to understand the movement to distinguish between the leaders and the followers. When you're talking about the rank and file, you're talking about a large group of people with very wide-ranging interests and agendas. So the foot soldiers might be thinking they're, fighting for things like what they consider traditional marriage or ban on abortion. But over time, the leaders of the movement and strategists of the movement have really kind of consciously reframed these culture war issues in order to capture the votes of the rank and file. They know very well if you can get people to vote on a single issue or two or three issues, you can basically control their vote. So they've used those issues to sort of solidify power for themselves and their allies, certainly to increase the flow of public money in their direction. And at the end of the day, they're also trying to enact economic policies that are going to benefit their sort of most well-resourced or their plutocratic funders.
Well, let's step back to the Johnson Amendment for a second, because this is the sort of seedy backstory of how this is getting done. And so we've heard about, President Trump has said, we're getting rid of the Johnson Amendment. And then he said, I got rid of the Johnson Amendment. None of that is true. However, the Johnson Amendment hasn't been really applied to these organizations anyway. But it's a provision in the tax code that prohibits 501c3 organizations from endorsing or opposing political candidates. And it's why the ACPC did a candidate survey this year. And it's available on our website, polkatheists.org, if you want to check it out. But it asks a broad range of questions that are of interest, issue questions that are of interest to secular voters. And then it leaves it up to you to decide what you want to do with that, right? There's not a scorecard. It's just, here's the 15 questions we asked and their answers as they returned them. So we're following the rules, but a lot of religious nonprofits don't. I was going to say try to blur the line or skirt the edge, but they don't even do that. They've jumped across the line. And in the book, you talk about like sort of going undercover in one of these events where we're going to tell you how to vote stuff, that gray area sort of happened. Talk about that. What was that like?
Oh, well, it was really eye-opening, I have to say. I think the term undercover is overheated. I did go using my own name. I went with a friend who was invited to join a group of conservative pastors as part of a Watchman on the Wall event. Now, Watchman on the Wall is a network of tens of thousands of conservative pastors. The Watchman on the Wall is an initiative that was started by the Family Research Council, which is one of the leading policy groups of the religious right. And it plays an enormous role in turning out the vote for these right-wing candidates. Look, leaders of the movement know that pastors drive votes. So if they make all this effort to get pastors into these networks and then deliver to them these tools such as voter guides, messaging materials, videos they can air at church, culture impact teams. I'll describe what that is soon. Instructions for forming culture impact teams within their church, all of which these pastors can use to turn their congregations out to vote for the hyper-conservative candidates that the movement favors. And they have sophisticated data tools as well that they allow pastors to make use of. So I just kind of want to give you an example. There I am in a small church in rural North Carolina, surrounded by dozens of pastors in the area. It's a swing district in advance of the 2018 election. So this area really matters. And the Watchmen on the Wall brought these pastors together to try and get them to turn out their congregations to vote. So, this was supposedly a nonpartisan event, but from the moment we entered the sanctuary, it was abundantly clear that there was no question how these pastors were supposed to instruct their congregations to vote. So they had all of these. They said, well, Tony Perkins, who is the head of the Family Research Councils, was there, and he said, I think this 2016 was a result of prayer. We're starting to see our country move back to a nation that respects life. When they say life, they're talking about abortion. And each subsequent speaker sort of hit home this issue of abortion. They know if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So they gave the pastors tools like this sort of voter guide. I'm not sure how much of this I'm allowed to show without violating copyright law or whatever, but it's got like 6 questions on it, 3 of which have to do with abortion on demand, taxpayer funding of abortion. So these are issues where they're saying, there's no question which way is a sort of correct biblical way to vote, your biblical values. And then they have here these sort of, Jane Doe, Democrat, John Smith, Republican, except they actually had real candidates that they were advocating people vote their biblical values on. So speaker after speaker after speaker said you need to get your congregants out to vote their biblical values. Then they also gave us tools like this. This is called a Culture Impact Team Resource Manual, and it's got about 150 pages of TAD material. And it's a very sophisticated tool. And the idea is for pastors to create within their churches teams of congregants that will communicate to other congregants how they should vote, the correct biblical view on certain issues and how they should vote, and then giving them the tools to help them, register to vote, get them out to vote, get them to the polls, etc. So one of the pastors I interviewed called this type of initiative, he said it threads a separation of church and state loophole. He called it a God-given loophole. This is a means of getting around that Johnson Amendment, where it's not the pastors necessarily saying, vote for John Smith, but he's finding the congregants who are going to go around to the other congregants and say, you all need to vote for John Smith. It was really interesting. So there was a lot of follow-up too with my friend. They started sending him lots of resource guides and resource manuals in an effort to sort of turn out these hyper-conservative, these conservative pastors to vote for these hyper-conservative candidates.
I want to take a little step back because this isn't your first foray into this sort of writing. And you've done a lot of on-the-ground research and investigation about this type of thing. What got you into this in the first place? How did you get interested in this topic? What got you started?
Thanks, Sarah, for this topic. I first fell down this rabbit hole, frankly, in 2009. I've fallen down a rabbit hole and can't get out. A Christian nationalist rabbit hole. So I got into the topic in 2009 when I was living in Santa Barbara with my husband and our daughter, who was like 6 years old, and a baby boy. And we were in Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is a really chill place. When you think about culture wars in Santa Barbara, it's like, do you drink Pinot or do you drink, Syrah? That kind of thing, right? Like really, our public school had 200 kids. It was a very religiously diverse, but about, I would say, a third to a half of the students were affiliated with the evangelical college, which was really near the school. But evangelicalism is really diverse. So there were progressive evangelicals. And we found out that a Good News Club was coming to our public school. And look, Good News Clubs are designed to convert very little children in their earliest years of learning into a deeply fundamentalist form of the evangelical faith. And some of the parents who were affiliated with the evangelical college next door to our school, Westmont, met with the Good News Club leaders, and they said, we know you mean well, we're Christians, we believe in the Great Commission too, but you're not right for the school. So we'd like to offer you free and better space in the Montecito Covenant Church. It's a church literally 40 feet away from our public school. You could just literally walk right next door and there you are. It said same time, better space, and for free. Good News Club leaders declined. So that really made me start questioning, like, why do they want to be in our public school? And rather than the church, I'd rather meet up in the church than in that sort of stinky public school, auditorium, And like, what do they really believe? And, I was really astonished to learn that not only were there thousands of these clubs operating in public schools nationwide, but they were exclusively targeting children in those elementary years. That's, K through 5 or K through 6, with tools that are offered for kids who are too young to read. Like the centerpiece of their program was called The Wordless Book. It's used to convert children too young to read, with a message that they're going to go to hell without Jesus. So in our community, I can see how these clubs confused very little kids into thinking that their school supported a particular form of the Christian faith, one that, by the way, most of my evangelical friends were really not in line with. And that I also saw they were using that misinformation to target, these kids were using that misinformation to target their non-Christian peers for faith-based bullying and bigotry. So these clubs, seemed wildly inappropriate in a diverse public school environment. But I also kind of thought they were a relic of the American past. And it turned out I was really wrong about that. So I decided to learn more. I went to their national convention in Talladega, Alabama. I thought if they think they have a right to come to my kid's school, I have a right to go to their convention. I attended Good News Clubs eventually around the country. I went through one of their training programs. The more I learned about the clubs, the more concerned I became. And I was really kind of stunned by their sophistication, their legal sophistication in particular, and the movement behind them. So I published that book that you mentioned earlier, The Good News Club, in 2012. And then over the years, just kept writing and digging deeper. And I realized that this sort of attack on public schools is really one small part of a larger attack on America as a modern secular democracy.
I'm gonna give a visualization of that in a minute. But the school issue, obviously I'm a parent, I have kids in the public schools, like that really hits home with me. But you're right. It's like it's the rabbit hole. It's like getting into YouTube and then it shows you another video and it shows you another video. And you might like this based on this that you've liked.
It was astonishing. I mean, I don't even know where to begin, but can I tell you a couple things?
Sure.
I brought a couple of great props today. Oh, I don't think I have them in front of me. Well, okay, so when I was at the National Convention of the Child Evangelism Fellowship, there were a bunch of speakers, like Matt Staver, who's the president and founder of Liberty Counsel. And he wrote a book called Same-Sex Marriage, Putting Every Household at Risk. I was like, really? Like, I mean, my husband and I have our share of, issues, as every couple does, but I can't think of a single one I would want to blame on any of my gay friends. Like, what's going on in his marriage? But it bears actually an endorsement by a guy named D. James Kennedy on the cover of his book. So here's D. James Kennedy's pamphlet, which is a pamphlet made out of a sermon that he delivered, I believe it was 1986, called A Godly Education. D. James Kennedy received at least $5.5 million from the family of Betsy DeVos. So, they've been funders. She's the Secretary of Education. They've been funding religious right networks and organizations for years. And here's what he wrote about public schools. My friends, the anti-Christian, anti-God bias, the censorship of all things Christian, the infusion of an atheistic, amoral, evolutionary, socialistic, anti-American system of education in our public schools has indeed become such that if it had been done by an enemy, it would be considered an act of war. I'm like, has he been to like public schools where they're teaching kids like state capitals and how to read? What are you talking about? So what I basically saw is that these initiatives it's not just that they want to have their voices included in the public square, which is what they always say in court. Oh, we're just like a soccer club. We just want to, use speech from our point of view. It's like, no, they actually are hostile to the whole project of public education. There's a deep hostility to public schools that goes deep into the sort of reactionary roots of the religious right that actually derives, its origins in the sort of, I believe, the pro-slavery theologians. It runs very, very deep in this movement. But they want to destroy public schools. And part of destroying public schools is sort of baked into that. It's a kind of hostility to pluralism, hostility to equality, hostility to critical thinking. I could go on.
When we first formed our organization, there really hasn't been anything in the county. And forgive me, listeners, I've told this story a million times. We have a lot of good folks in Orlando that are doing some great work, and a lot of folks in Tampa that are doing great work. And then there's this red, rural, sort of backwoodsy hole between the two, and that's Polk County. And there just hasn't been a lot of good activism, at least not in a while. And so right out of the gate, we had parents reaching out to us with, my kid was handed a Gideon Bible during graduation practice, prayers at graduations that we had to address with the school board. We have, there are some concerns about the Fellowship of Christian Athletes using school property and for video projects and other things. And then so right here we walked in, and there's already, all of that sort of stuff has its tendrils in. And then you layer on top of that Florida's love relationship with the voucher. Like we are home base for the voucher programs, right? Like this is the proving grounds. This is where you come to learn how to do it right. And so we're also dealing with all of that. You've got voucher program schools that are receiving my taxpayer dollars that right on their website say, if we find out your kid's gay, they're out. If we find out you're gay, you can't teach here. Like,
not only that, it's really interesting. When I was writing The Power Worshippers, I focused on this one school almost by accident. It's called Foundation Academy. It's in Florida, I think Winter Garden, I believe, Florida. Although don't quote me. And not only do they say that they don't just say you can't be gay. They say, and first of all, they pair by with homosexuality, lesbianism, and bisexuality with incest and bestiality in the same sentence, which is a really offensive thing to do. But they say any expression, promotion. This could include like wearing a rainbow scrunchie in your hair, or wearing a certain kind of a T-shirt, and they say this could be grounds for expulsion. But they also say they have a passage in their student parent handbook of 2016, 2017 that says essentially that being a good citizen means being anti-abortion. They say protecting the unborn until natural death. So they sort of have a very particular orientation about that. And they also have a passage in there about how women have a God-given responsibility to submit to their husbands and also be respectful of them. There is no similar statement about how men have a God-given responsibility to be respectful to their wives. And in fact, they insist on a kind of male headship at home. And it's very interesting. So they have this sort of very, language about gender order within families in their handbook. Now, look, people have a right to their religion. They have a right to start religious schools. Frankly, I don't have a problem with that, but they don't have a right to commandeer the public resources. My taxpayer dollars are yours in order to promote this kind of ideology, this kind of gender ideology is what I'm going to call it, and these types of their religious beliefs. That's something they should do on their own time and on their own dime. Yeah,
well, and that speaks to the broader issue that we're seeing all over right now with the idea that the persecution complex is if you're stepping across the line and we say no, we're persecuting you. Like no, you don't get to use taxpayer dollars to promote candidates. You don't get to use taxpayer dollars to indoctrinate your children, discriminatory things. Like we're seeing that everywhere now. But I want to pull on a thread that you mentioned earlier. So the school voucher backstory to me is very interesting because so like my generation, right? I was born in 1979. We didn't get taught this. But the roots of this whole thing were very well covered up by that time and very well whitewashed. So we learned about segregation, sure, in sort of a glancing pass, right? But not about the link between segregated schools and the efforts today, the privatization of schools and voucher programs. That link you didn't notice until later, when you have to do your own research to sort of dig that stuff up. So you're obviously not the first person to have written about it recently, but every time I read someone else writing about it, I learn a little bit more. And so talk just a little bit about that sort of that link between school segregation and the privatization of schools and taxpayer funds.
Well, I think we can go back, if we're talking about this issue, to the start of a political movement called the New Right. And it was a group of folks, including Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie. Phyllis Schlafly was involved, Howard Phillips, and some others. They brought in Jerry Falwell as well, that was trying to kind of ignite a hyper-conservative counter-revolution. And they were very unhappy with the direction of the Republican Party at the time. It had become too liberal, too soft on communism in their view. Also, sort of more progressive conceptions or liberal conceptions of religion, and mainline Christianity was very strong at the time, and they were very unhappy with that. They felt like religion had become too liberal as well. So they wanted to sort of ignite this hyper-conservative counter-revolution in our society, and they were looking for an issue that they could use to ignite their new movement. And they were really upset about the what they considered a threat of the tax advantages of segregated schools. When Bob Jones Sr., who was an openly ardent segregationist, he called segregation God's established order. He was segregating his schools, and the IRS was looking at him and saying, "Why are we giving you these tax exemptions for these segregated schools?" And these folks thought they had not only a right to segregate schools, but also a right to tax subsidies. So they were really upset about that. But they knew that, stop the unfair tax on segregation was not going to play well with the general public. It's just such an ugly racist sentiment, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there were a number of issues that they considered that they were really upset about. I mean, the women's movement, they were really worried about that, but the ERA at the time was going down in flames. They were really upset about issues around school prayer. But it was sort of like, abortion was not at the top of their list, because actually most Republican Protestants supported abortion law liberalization at the time. But when they got to the issue of abortion, they sort of considered it, and it was like a light bulb went off. And they considered a lot of the language surrounding issues of reproductive freedom and abortion and stuff like that. And they recognized that when people spoke about abortion law liberalization, it tapped into certain kinds of anxieties that people had about gender order, about reorganization, they felt, of society and things like that. And they thought this could really work. So, over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. And what we see today is a kind of dividing line in the movement, not between any particular theological distinction necessarily. I mean, again, the movement draws in conservative Catholics and sort of hyper-conservative Catholics, conservative evangelicals, and other denominations, but really between whether you're sort of pro-life or not, right? Whether you take a completely extreme position on this one issue or not. Now, I mean, let's look at what was happening at the time that Roe versus Wade was passed in 1973. As I mentioned, most Protestant Republicans supported it. I mean, Ronald Reagan signed into law the most liberal abortion law in 1967. Southern Baptist Convention, they passed 2 resolutions affirming abortion law liberalization. The first was in 1971. And when Roe versus Wade was passed, they published an article in one of their publications hailing the decision as a sensible middle ground. They really thought that this was a sensible thing to do. Betty Ford, she called abortion law liberalization a great, great decision. Barry Goldwater, his wife, Peggy, co-founded Planned Parenthood in Arizona. That's like one of my favorite little factoids. Can you imagine the wife of some male Republican politician doing that today? It just wouldn't even happen. It wouldn't be thinkable. But, it's like over time, the sort of Republican Party was purged of its pro-choice voices. Phyllis Schlafly actually wrote a really compelling book about that process, and it took a lot of time and a lot of effort. But they have succeeded in using this issue to unite their movement. I mean, I think we all know people who've justified their votes in certain areas by saying, well, I just need to save the babies. And that's, right, that's where it starts and that's where it ends. So here's a funny thing, the religious right they claim to be great defenders of the American family, but they are endorsing economic policy. So the movement has long been allied with libertarian, hyper-conservative wing of the Republican Party that's promoting policies that are actually intensifying economic inequality and making it so much harder for families to succeed. So they're claiming to defend the family, but they're actually endorsing politicians that promote these policies that are making it so challenging for families to succeed. And we know that economic instability is a great destabilizer for the family.
Sure. And when you think about the issue of abortion, this is a drum that we try to beat often, and something that we're going to have to, at some point, we're going to team up with some other local organizations and groups to address with our public school system. And that's the idea of actually teaching comprehensive sex education to our kids. If you want abortions to decrease for whatever reason, pick a reason. If you want
no woman wakes up and says, I think I'm going to have Should I get my nails done or have, no, this only happens because somebody is pregnant against their will. And, if we can decrease the number of abortions, you'd want to increase access to birth control and health care. You'd want to increase access to meaningful information so people can protect themselves from unintended pregnancies. But the religious right, they seem determined to erode support for those types of things.
Yeah, just don't do it. That solves it. Just don't. Abstinence is the way. Anyway, I could talk about this all day long. But so one of the things that the book did for me, this is the visualization that I sort of take away, is like yarn on a bulletin board, or like the weeds in my garden where you pull on one and the root goes down like 4 feet away. There's another shoot, and you just keep pulling and pulling and pulling. And so you give a tug at something like a bill that seeks to put "In God We Trust" on our schools, which is stupid, and we passed it in Florida because we're idiots. But you pull on that weed and you find Project Blitz, and we've discussed that at great length. And if you keep pulling, you get to Randy Forbes and the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation and the Family Research Council and Watchmen on the Wall and the Federalist Society and eventually the Family and all of these sort of names that are out in the nebulous. I think a lot of us know of them, have heard stories about them. And maybe the documentary, The Family, really woke up a lot of people to this, but I still don't think people truly appreciate just how well organized and how well funded this whole thing is.
Exactly. I mean, the movement consists of a variety of both for-profit, nonprofit organizations, both religious and non-religious. It derives a lot of its funding from plutocratic, sort of hyper-wealthy leaders that are as committed to sort of free market fundamentalism as they are to right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars. In fact, I think the culture war stuff, I think we often mistake this as a culture war. It's not. It's a political movement. And when you look at the issues that they're promoting, they're issues in economic policy, domestic policy, foreign policy, which drives home the fact that this is a political movement. So I think that sometimes we can't meet our challenges as a society unless people really have a sense of what it is that they're up against. And I tried to get inside the machinery of the movement in my reporting. It's like, advocacy organizations like the Family Research Council, policy groups, and legal advocacy organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom and Liberty Council, legal sort of hunt houses like the Federalist Society, which plays an outsized role in grooming and promoting candidates for the courts. Trump has, at this point, I think 210 of his nominations have been confirmed. So we have like nearly 25% of the federal bench. appeals. We've got almost 3 Supreme Court justices. I mean, the courts really matter. Data initiatives. I, went deep inside one of the sort of very interesting data initiatives where they have this tool where they give pastors, they have a tool helping pastors compare congregation lists to voter rolls, so they can see what percentage of their congregations voted in the last election.
Wow.
Gave them an individual voter lookup tool, so they could see how whether individual congregants in their congregations voted. And a lot of that is using, there are multiple data initiatives, but they're incredibly sophisticated and use sort of psychographic targeting, figuring out whether people have ever signed like a pro-life list, or whether they even a member of NASCAR, or if they like fishing, and assigning them points for each of these characteristics. Do they go to church on a regular basis? And then if they get a certain number of points, they target them to go after them to help turn out, get that person a vote. I mean, I went deep inside the sort of international movement, what they call the global conservative movement, which is a sort of coalition of similarly religious nationalist-minded leaders in various countries that are sort of collaborating on what they see as a war on they call it a global war on global liberalism, in favor of more sort of autocratic forms of governance. So I tried to sort of get into these different sort of sectors of the movement. I talk about, media and messaging platforms. It's a very sophisticated movement. I think there are those who still sort of mistakenly sort of say, what, this is the religious right, what are you talking about? This is a movement that brought Trump to power. It's extraordinarily well-funded, extraordinarily well-organized. They have made a lot of gains, even during the Obama years, certainly through the courts and by investing in all the tools of modern campaign infrastructure. We're really seeing the consequences of that organization building today.
I think you really hit the nail on the head when you say we can't just see this as a social movement. And I think that's a failing that we, they just don't like the gays, or they, it's all about abortion. But again, like, pull that weed and there's a whole lot more connected to it, and they're all interconnected. And that's, yeah. So I want to talk about, more about the hijacked elephant in the room and some more of what we can do. But I have a viewer question for you here. Subject of your book and friend of the show and of the ACPC, Joseph Richardson, is watching in the chat today.
Hi, Joseph.
Joseph says, given her knowledge in writing about Tim Grossen's politically active pastor from the First Baptist Winter Garden, would love to know her thoughts on Jamie Grosshen's appointment to the Florida Supreme Court, and that's daughter-in-law of Tim. You have any thoughts on that?
Thanks so much, Joseph. I don't have any thoughts other than what I put in my book. I wrote about her career, and she's been very public about some of her views. And I write about sort of where she obtained her education and how she's sort of. But I will speak, a little more specifically about the role of the Federalist Society in like grooming and promoting these candidates, and sort of bringing through what another writer has called the right, I think he called like the terrarium, the right wing legal terrarium, where they find somebody with the sort of correct views on these issues, and they get them funded fellowships and clerkships and things like that. An extraordinary amount of. I was shocked to learn the amount of money that flows through the Federalist Society. There's a great report in the Washington Post between 2014 and 2017. Leonard Leo, who is heading up the Federalist Society, or has headed it up, he and his adjacent organizations, Federalist Society and their adjacent organizations, raised, I think it was like $250 million. Like an extraordinary amount of money has flowed through that sort of right-wing legal ecosystem. I was really shocked to learn that money is actually spent promoting candidates for the Supreme Court. I mean, why would anybody spend money on that? Isn't the record of the candidate itself supposed to be? I'm so naive, right?
Yep. Same.
I'm so naive, right? But I'm less naive than I was. So there's one report, and I would have to go through it, but it's been the report has been picked up by others. It says over $150 million has been spent on getting Amy Coney Barrett confirmed to the Supreme Court. Over $150 million. And that includes ad buys, lobbying, probably every person who's in the position of voting on that, all those sort of Republican senators. It's interesting. I know of the ad buys because I've heard them and I've seen them. I've also seen sort of pro-Barrett stuff written in every, all the different websites that I follow, all the different messaging platforms that I follow, all of these articles. It's really kind of shocking, the amounts of money and we really don't have any equivalent on the left. There was or on the progressive side. We have obviously Americans United for Separation of Church and State and FFRF, but the amounts of money that go to those organizations is dwarfed by the amount of money that flows through the right-wing legal ecosystem.
And I think another piece that ties into that is we just, and I'll speak as secular people more as, left or right. We don't organize well, and we haven't organized well. I think maybe we're starting to get better at that. We're starting to see Americans United and FFRF and American Atheists and the American Humanist Association, and all of those organizations are sort of coming together to battle Goliath. But we tend to also be anti-authoritarian and more egalitarian, and we see the world so differently.
Herding cats is the proper term.
It is, yes, it is. So it's like, how the hell do you get us together to
You study, this is what they did, okay? This is what the new right did very explicitly. They said, we studied the left to find out, what worked for them. And, they learned from the left. And at that time, sort of more progressive ideas about religion and certainly a move toward equality was sort of ascendant in the culture. They looked at the left and studied its successes, and they said, we also tried certain things and weren't afraid to fail. So I think one thing that they have learned and that we could learn, and they really do right, is they unify when necessary. Yeah. Voting is, yes, of course, it's an expression of your values, but more than that, you have to be tactical with your vote. The front runner may not be the person you necessarily favored, or they might have said something you didn't like back in 1989, or done something that you didn't like. But at the end of the day, you really have to look. Do I affirm the principles of equality and pluralism? Do I defend our constitutional principles? Do I respect the rule of law? By the way, law and order starts from the very top. It really does.
Yeah.
It starts from the top. Do we affirm the rule of law? Do we affirm pluralism and equality and the great principles that have been that our founding documents aspire to, even though they've been applied imperfectly over time? They're still beautiful ideals. Do we affirm that, or are we sort of going to vote for candidates who are going to usher in an era of intensified religious nationalism?
Yeah.
So I think that we need to unify when necessary. Another thing that they really do well is they have a real positive culture of voting. They make you feel, no matter how old you are or young you are or disabled, whatever your condition, your vote matters. If you're red state, blue state, your vote matters. It's really important to participate, and they thank people for their vote. And I think we need to do the same thing. To be honest, those of us who reject the politics of conquest and division could learn a few lessons. It's like, I went to this Evangelicals for Trump event a few weeks ago. No, it's actually a couple months ago. Everything's online now. Yeah. And there was a fellow there named Johnny Moore, one of the 4 key speakers, and he said, become an evangelist for the vote. And I thought, I'm going to be an evangelist for the vote. So find the 3 key people that only you can get to, and really hold them accountable to vote. And I think, if everybody just does one step up from what we all did the last time, we could maybe start to restore some of our norms and affirm some of the values that we hold dear.
I think we need to take a good hard look at what we value and how we approach voting in general. And, this is true of all levels of elections. Because you're right. In 2016, we saw the right half, like when Ted Cruz dropped out, all the people who had been lined up behind Ted Cruz went and lined up behind somebody else.
Yes, absolutely.
And then when Kasich dropped out, or whatever order it was, right? Kasich drops out, all of those people move and scatter behind someone else until there's one left. And now they're all in line behind them. And half of the left went, fuck you, I'm not voting for Hillary.
I know, it's crazy. You know, it's funny.
It's just
before
that different
election,
ideology. Yeah.
For every election, I hear religious right leaders standing up there and say, this election is about judges, judges, judges. And it is. I mean, to a large degree, you don't have to just look at the front runner. Look at the judges they're going to appoint, nominate. Look at the people they're going to top to head different cabinets. It really goes beyond the front runner and their particular personality and all that stuff. Yeah.
Growing up, I didn't get. I grew up in a small town of 1,400 people in the middle of the cornfields in Illinois, and I didn't really get that sort of election indoctrination of, voting is. I did when I worked in talk radio. I worked in conservative talk radio for a while, and I was a dumb 19-year-old kid, and they gave me all kinds of shit for not voting, right? But I didn't get that at home. My parents didn't take me to vote. It wasn't part of the process. It wasn't drilled into me. In the way that for many people, the idea of voting as your civic duty is akin to serving in the military, right? It's pretty close to par. I didn't get that. And so I didn't vote until probably my mid-30s. It's the last couple of elections. So I didn't get that. I am making sure that our kids go with us to vote every time. If for no other reason, what it looks like on the inside of a polling place. You know what the process looks like. But also it gives us an opportunity to, discuss. We watch the debates with our oldest, who's 10. So we're trying to turn that around. But I didn't get that, and I certainly didn't get the importance of the courts. And I think that is a message that we're not getting out far and loud enough yet.
Now, here's the other thing. I think people assume that in a country like the United States, majority rules, and it doesn't. We're a country where 40 to 50% of people don't vote. Many people have their votes basically stolen from them through disenfranchisement, voter suppression, race-based gerrymandering, and the like. All you need to dominate in elections is a very committed, networked, and organized minority. And that's what the religious right is. I've been to, I was at one event where Ralph Reed, he's one of the movement leaders, said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. So I'll just give you an example of how a relatively small proportion of the population is able to win in election seasons. George Barna did some research. He's one of the evangelical pollsters who's very embedded in the movement. And he estimated the most devoted religious right supporters number just 10% of the population. But in 2016, and these are people who don't just vote, but they also they're the ones going house to house or, making, members of the culture impact teams in the churches. He said, these people number only 10% of the population, but in 2016, 91% turned out to vote. And 93% of those cast their vote for Trump. So when you get a relatively small group, but they can punch, vastly above their political weight because they vote in disproportionate numbers, that's when you get some of the consequences that we're seeing today. But so here's the good news. Those tools are available to all of us. I think, getting people out to vote proportionately,
right.
And certainly to try and get the vote out in those types of numbers. If we could all vote in that way, I think we would start to see more sort of rational and frankly law-abiding governance in our society.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up here with that sort of, how do we dig ourselves out of this? I know it's the $1 million question, and vote is a big part of it. What else can we do?
I think that there are things that we can do as individuals, like voting and becoming evangelists for voting in your circle. And there are things, there's a lot of opportunities to volunteer. It's really important to make sure you vote not just for the presidential election, candidate, but also for the down ballot candidates. And it's really important to hold people accountable to their promises once you put people in office that you support. And there are things we can do only when we join together. I mean, the religious right is invested for decades in all of the sort of tools of modern campaign infrastructure, and we too can get involved in some of those areas, whether it's messaging, whether it's policy groups, whether it's certainly efforts to protect the vote. They're using the tools of democracy to dismantle democracy, but those same tools can be used to restore it.
I love it. Let's go ahead and wrap it up here then. I would love to talk to you some other time about there's so many conversations that we could go down the rabbit hole and spend a whole hour talking about. But I just want to thank you for your time chatting today. I think far too many, average Americans are just oblivious to all of this, to how deep it is and connected and funded and sinister, all of those things. So we encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book, The Power Worshippers, and get educated. There is a lot in this book that will be eye-opening.
Thanks. And if there are anybody has questions that I didn't answer today, please feel free to reach out through goodnewskatherine@gmail.com. Love to hear from you.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for spending some time with me today. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to see you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch, I'm sure. This isn't going away. All right. I do want to tell you folks before we wrap up the show, just very briefly, we did launch a new initiative of Street Warriors. So Street Warriors is a nonprofit organization that we've been working with. They are a faith-based group, and it's a group that we came together over common ground, which is to say there are people in our community who are experiencing homelessness, and this is the least we can do to help them. But we get together once a week and feed people who need a hot meal. So if you want to get involved in that, we have, as the atheist community of Polk County, we have branched out and created Street Warriors Winter Haven. So the Street Warriors group focuses on Lakeland. We have Winter Haven now, and we're going to do some great things there. We need people to cook an entree every week and help pack up bags and then go out and distribute meals to folks where we can. We have big dreams of how we can grow this into something even bigger and better. If your values line up with the humanist values where nobody should sleep under a bridge tonight, we want to be a part of solving that. So go to polkatheists.org. You can find out all the information there on that program and all the other things that we do working out in the community. So I want to wrap up the show today and just once again remind you to pick up the book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. That's available at all fine bookstores everywhere. But if you're an Amazon shopper, you can also go to smile.amazon.com and make sure Atheist Community of Polk County is set up as your charity of choice. My many thanks again to Katherine Stewart for joining us today. And Freethought in Florida is available on YouTube, Facebook video, most podcast players. Just search for the show in your favorite app or find our subscribe links at our website. And as always, you can find out all about the ACPC or make a donation at polkatheists.org. Follow us on @polkatheists at all the social media. And of course, dear God, please remember the three most important things. Don't touch anything, wash your hands, and wear your mask. That's it. We'll see you on the next Freethought in Florida. Be safe, everybody.